Danny, what's going on?
Hey, I guess I'm an atheist, but I don't know why I would need Jesus, even if I were to grant a lot of what Christians think or a lot of the Bible.
Okay. So would you, first off, thanks for coming out, man. This is, I don't, some of these lives are like super antagonistic. I love a good conversation. So I appreciate you coming and appreciate your honesty. So when you say you're an atheist, do you lean more towards a agnostic perspective of like, there might be a God, there might not, I'm just not sure. And so because I don't have evidence, I haven't been able to subscribe to that, or more towards I know there's not a God and more of a militant approach to, about that.
Yeah, I would say I believe there are no gods.
Okay. So you've looked at the evidence and you're convinced that based upon that there are no gods.
Something like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So I'd be curious on like kind of what evidence you've looked at that has allowed you, because I understand the agnostic position of like, I've just not been convinced yet. But when it sounds like that maybe you're a step beyond that in a more, I have a high degree of confidence that there are no gods. What has kind of brought you to that conclusion?
Well, if we're bracketing thin conceptions of God like Hera, not Cleopatra, but the Egyptian pantheon, the Norse pantheon. I was thinking of Isis, but there's reasons why I don't accept those. And I guess that's somewhat related to why I don't accept other religions, but those look clearly made up. There's evidence against those views or those sorts of pantheons, and it just looks like human beings like to make up shit about deity. I think a lot of Christians would agree with me on that point. Actually, right? There's a lot of criticism. I mean, in a way, the Bible and Jesus are pretty critical of religion. So I take those criticisms as well as far as a stronger conception of God, like an all-powerful, good, all-knowing being, or something like that. There are going to be other issues that the pagan gods don't suffer from, like things like the problem of evil.
Sure. Yeah. So you would, I think we would have agreement about, say, the Roman and Greek pantheon or Norse gods. I think we would be in probably a much similar, critique. I think we would probably find some similar critiques, over things like Mormonism or Islam, I would imagine. And so, but I think that there is something unique about the Christian testimony of who Jesus is. Specifically evidence for the resurrection. I think we could also, and I'm sure you're a smart guy, you can tell right away, I'm sure you're familiar with, say, evidences of say, fine tuning. I'd be curious on maybe what you think about those.
Yeah, as far as evidence for the resurrection, I mean, I've heard some of that presumed evidence, and it's not very convincing to me. I've looked a little bit into what might have happened 2,000 years ago. I'm not very convinced that someone rose from the dead. We could talk about that first, or do you want me to give my thoughts on fine-tuning?
I think the resurrection is more interesting. I mean, honestly, because if Jesus rose from the dead, then it doesn't seem, quite as much of a stretch that there is a God, or if we establish that actually happened, there's a supernatural experience. I do think that, I always encourage people, I think you have to answer both of those questions. Infinite regress and these sorts of things, I think, is a problem for the atheists in the same way that believing in a God might be a problem, for the Christians to defend. And I think that there's a degree of faith that required, no matter what you believe in that sense. But let's talk about the resurrection. So, my position would be this, is that, we have a tremendous amount of evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. I think, to start with, virtually every major scholar, skeptic and believing alike, believes, and holds the idea that Jesus was a real person. Would you, be comfortable affirming or at least, conceding that point?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. And so we also have the majority of scholars, believing and unbelieving, even the Bart Ehrmans of the world, believe that Jesus was crucified and that he was placed in a grave outside of the city of Jerusalem. Are you comfortable, kind of at least getting that far with me?
Yeah, definitely that he's crucified. I think that you're also correct about the burial, although I'm less confident about that. But we can just say that he was buried outside of.
Yeah.
That's fine. But I definitely about the crucifixion, that's pretty much fine.
Yeah, no, cool. So, and that always helps, because obviously you get people on here that are like, Jesus wasn't even a real person, and scholarly evidence would obviously point to otherwise, and scholars would again, that believing and unbelieving alike, for anybody else that's watching here, would hold strongly to that, no, Jesus did exist and he was crucified. So, what we have is that there's something unique about this guy that exists, 2,000 years ago. And there's something about his death and what, appears, or at least is testified to have happening after his death, that created a tremendous amount of turmoil in first century Judea. So much so that it actually reaches up to the Roman government. We have a thing that was discovered called the Nazareth inscription. Are you familiar with that?
The Nazareth description, you said?
Inscription.
No, I don't. That doesn't ring a bell.
So yeah, it's basically an archaeological discovery. It's a stone tablet or placard that's about 2 feet tall, and on this description, they believe that this comes from the reign of Claudius. It could be as early as about 40 A.D. I think Claudius was like from 40 to 60, I believe, somewhere around there, and so. In this, we have a Roman edict that specifically is placed in the city of Nazareth, where Jesus was from, that says that it is now punishable by death. It's a brand new kind of law that was put out. It's punishable by death for anybody to steal a body from a tomb. Now, we don't have, it doesn't say because of Jesus, claims of Jesus being risen from the dead on there. So, there are scholars that, most scholars, I think, would point to this being connected to the claims of the resurrection. Some would say it's unrelated, but I think that the majority would claim that this is related to the resurrection, that we have evidence that seems to show in a very early time period that there were claims of his body going missing with no good reason why. And so much so that they changed the law in order to make taking a body punishable by death. So Jesus, that's one sliver of evidence. But we have, between the testimonies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Book of Acts, we have Paul quoting in 1 Corinthians 15. He quotes a phrase that was a rabbinical, basically like memorization creed, where he talks about how, that this was passed on to him, that, Jesus died, was crucified, that he appeared to the disciples, he appeared to, himself, he appeared to James, his half-brother, who was a skeptic of Jesus, he appeared to the 500, he appeared to the women, and, that he rose from the dead. And most scholars put that as early as about, there's very few scholars that would put that beyond the year 45 AD. So we have like these early claims, so, and I'll hand this back over to you, but I think that, if you look at kind of the major theories of that tries to explain the resurrection, it's either the mythic theory that this was made up later on, which I think that the evidence that presented, is alone sufficient to deny the fact that this was made up later on. I think we have early testimony to the resurrection claim. We have the hallucination theory that, all of these people just, saw what they wanted to see, or that, it was some sort of spiritual apparition that happened. And then we have the conspiracy theory that this was all, kind of a big hoax or a ploy or some sort of money grab. And then we have to deal with the fact of so many of Jesus's, firsthand disciples that would have been the ones to generate this conspiracy. That they believe so strongly in the resurrection that we have sufficient evidence to show that they were martyred for their faith, instead of going, hey guys, we were lying about this. And I think that leaves us with the last claim, which is the actual resurrection theory that has the most evidence supporting it.
Yeah. So first, before we get started, I have a very, very, very low prior of people coming back from the dead after 3 days of being dead.
Sure.
Right. So what you're going to have to do is present data that overcomes that terribly low prior. Right. And some of the stuff you mentioned, like the martyrdom, I don't think that's, I mean, I know there was a lot of martyrdom, post first century, but I don't, there's not, a lot of the martyrdom that the tradition claims happened to the early disciples is not really well attested to, sort of legendary. These reports of Jesus appearing to James and other people, I'm not so sure why I should accept any of that. But, these other theories about, I'm not so sure what these theories are supposed to explain, right? What is hallucination and stealing the body supposed to explain exactly?
Yeah. So these are sort of the critical theories, that attempt to explain away the resurrection, because scholars are in, almost near universal agreement that Jesus was a real person and that he was crucified. Deal with where did these claims come from? So,
I'm fine with to say that he was crucified and then he died and then there was a burial site of some time or tomb. But how does that mean that he's likely resurrected?
Well, we have that Christianity is the largest religion in the world. Something happened after his death that propelled Christianity to go from a religion of fishermen and poor people from Nazareth and Bethlehem to being so influential that it literally eclipses all of the well-established beliefs that Rome had, and became the most prominent faith, and that its followers and adherents were willing to literally go to the grave or at times throw themselves to the lions.
Okay, well, let's talk about that. So within the first 400 years after Jesus was said to have been crucified, right? Do you know what century had the biggest explosion of conversions? Out of the first, second, third, fourth century, which of those centuries had the biggest explosion of conversions?
I don't have numerical data to say. I could probably talk about several times in which that happened. I mean, to start with, we see that there was a major in about 60.
What would you guess is the biggest explosion out of the first 400 years? What century?
I think there was an early explosion at the end of the first century, and I would say probably later on when you had like Diocletian, persecution and these things that were taking place later. There was probably a massive push then. I think.
I think that, but what the data actually shows, I think that's incorrect. The largest explosion was in the 4th century, right, where 10% of these are estimations. 10% of the population was Christian by the end of the second century. Sorry, and then during the 4th century, you've got 50% of the population estimated to be Christian. In the first, second, and third, first 100 years or first 200 years of Christianity, you didn't get above 5% of the population that was Christian. So there was in fact, some scholars say that the rate of conversions actually mirrors that of Mormonism, the first few hundred years of Mormonism. So really the explosion of Christianity wasn't until 4th century, and that was mainly because of Constantine and the state actually declaring a religion more than anything else. So really, to me, you take that fact into consideration, as well as there is something, I would agree with you, there's something interesting about Christianity. All right, here they're preaching about one God that loves you, is willing to die for you, whereas all the pagan gods like Zeus and Hera, they're all assholes, right? They don't love you, they don't care about you, right? There's something interesting about a God willing to die for you to that extent. I'm not saying that the gospel is completely unenticing. So if you take that in conjunction with a state-declared religion in the 4th century, you get a big explosion. There wasn't a big explosion in the first 200 years. First 200 years of Christianity, actually.
Yeah, I don't know as though I'd push back on anything, that you just said. I mean, obviously, we have these later, persecutions that take place that then lead to eventually, the kind of this tipping point as you have, Constantine. I mean, even during the time of Augustine,
But I would argue the persecutions actually fueled the growth of Christianity, because in the Roman Empire, persecution was not continuous and not systematized.
Agreed.
It was like if you're trying to treat, let's say, an infection, it was like taking one pill of antibiotics every other day, right? You're not, if anything, it's going to make it worse because you're just killing off the more susceptible bacterium. In the same way, what persecution does, if you don't systematize it, and if it's not continuous, is actually inspire it could be inspirational. Martyrdom is inspirational. So to me, persecution actually fueled Christianity, not inhibited it in the early years.
Yeah, look, church fathers would agree with you. Tertullian said the death of the martyr is the seed of the church. That was in the 2nd century. And so, that's certainly a position that I think Christians would agree, with that. I don't think that just because it took a couple hundred years for Christianity to really, start changing massive numbers on a national percentage scale with how many people believed in it, that makes us have to, be able to disregard the early testimonies and the fact that we have to say what led to the acceptance of this to be.
Well, all of this is to say that you want to say the growth of Christianity should be attributed to the resurrection. But it seems like I have 3 pretty good explanations for the growth of Christianity.
So let me clarify that. I think you might have misunderstood. So I would say that the initial acceptance of Christianity. So like if you look at Mormonism, okay, and I think that's a great example. And the same would be true for Islam. Both Joseph Smith and Muhammad have these claims, and they're actually very similar, ironically, of where they have this appearance of some sort of prophetic angelic being. They at first both think that they're demonized. They're so much so that Muhammad considers tossing himself off of a cliff. Joseph Smith talks about being clenched and can't breathe and all these sort of things. This darkness comes over him. They eventually kind of believe that this is some sort of angelic encounter. And as they start testifying to this, they're immediately not accepted in the area in which they received the vision. And they have to move on to another city to where nobody knows them in order to actually be able to pick up any steam. Christianity doesn't do that. And I think that this is something, I'd be curious if you find this compelling, is that Christianity, it stays in the city in which the claim is made that Jesus rose from the dead. And so they continue in the city where, if you and I both lived, say, in, let's say, Fort Wayne, Indiana, which is not a very big city, or let's go Plymouth, Indiana, which is a very small city. And we claim that, the road that we drive by every single day, that an alien spaceship landed on top of the general store there, and it's still sitting there to this day. It would be easy for us to verify, and anybody that lives in that town would go, I drive by that every day, and I know there's no alien spaceship sitting on top of that general store. And so what Christianity does is it stays in the city in which it was born for some time, where the disciples continue to testify in their own town, where anybody could go to a known grave. Jesus was a prominent figure. He was known by people in that area. His crucifixion was well, attested to, and so much so that when he is put into a grave, people could walk by that grave, and there's no contradictions. We see nothing in history that ever tries to come against where the body was at. And they stay in that. I think it's compelling. They're willing to stay in that area. Wait, so to clarify, you weren't saying that evidence of the resurrection is the surprising triumph of Christianity over the next, 600 years after his death and supposed resurrection. You weren't trying to say that? I'm saying that I think that you have, regardless if nobody believed it after the first generation, the fact that people accepted it who lived in Jerusalem and who knew Jesus personally, and also those who were convinced by people who stayed in that area, that's you don't start a cult or a false belief or a made-up faith in the city in which you are claiming that somebody rose from the dead, when anybody can walk down to the gravesite to see if there's a body there or if the stone is still in front of you.
Even if that was right, even if that's typically not the case, that a false religion or a cult doesn't originate that way, that's not going to exceed my low priors of someone coming back from the dead.
Sure.
Right. So, but I'm glad we agreed then that the growth of Christianity in the first 400 years is not evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. There are plenty of good explanations for why that might have happened.
I would say it's not full evidence. I think it's a data point. I don't think, I think, and I mean, I would think that, I would imagine you could at least give me that, if it requires, let's say 100 data points for you to accept it, you could say, well, this is interesting, but it's not by itself sufficient.
Okay. It might be a data point. Like if Jesus did, I mean, honestly, if Jesus did resurrect, I would expect Christianity to grow faster than Mormonism. Right. And it didn't. Right? It doesn't look like it did, actually. So if anything, that data point kind of goes in my favor that it was only until, these are estimations, around 300 AD that 10% of the population was like Christian, right? I would expect that number to be way higher if someone came back from the dead and then showed himself to 500 people plus.
Well, think about the world in which Mormonism came into. First of all, a major growth of Mormonism was actually Mormon missionaries going over to England, where there was already an understanding that Christians went on a pilgrimage to America, and that for the purpose of establishing the kingdom of God. That was a belief of constitutionalists, the Congregationalists that were coming over and pilgrims. And so you have Mormon missionaries that are going over and saying, hey guys, we found the kingdom of God. It was appeared to us. Come on over here. And so there's major growth. Jesus' name, they co-opt. He was already, recognized as as divine, as a holy figure. And so they're building off of familiarity. Christianity is going against, a well-established paganism that you would expect it to take longer to take root.
Not if someone rose from the dead and appeared to over hundreds of people. In fact, I would expect an immediate explosion, and there really wasn't.
Yeah. So what would be your claim then on how do you deal with these testimonies of resurrection? So what I was saying earlier that you had asked about is the theories that are out there is a mythic theory. This is one that skeptics hold to, is that this was just the story of the resurrection started later. You have the conspiracy theory that the disciples were in on it, and there was some sort of ploy to, for personal gain or something. And you have the hallucination theory, which is that all these people that claim that they saw something really didn't see something.
Okay, so what are you trying to? You're asking me how do I explain the testimonies?
Yeah, how do you explain away the existing data that there is for the resurrection?
But you're specifically asking about the testimonies. I mean, you and I reject testimonies all the time, right? There are testimonies about Muhammad splitting the moon or whatever. There are testimonies about the golden plates. There are testimonies all over the place, right? The fact that it's a testimony to something that wouldn't occur very often, that goes against our priors, it's not a worry for the person that's skeptical.
So you still have to deal with the amount of, so two things on this. So first off, if God is real, then somebody being raised from the dead is not a big deal, especially if it's God in the flesh.
No, I mean, if you think God is real and you still think it's a big deal that people are raised from the dead, in fact, that's why you think he's God. It is a big deal.
Sure, it's a big deal. It's a miracle, but it's not as big a deal as, say, creation itself. Creation is the greatest miracle that there is. The fact that, God took, literally.
Okay, so it is a big deal. So it's not, you're saying it wasn't a big deal, but it is, even if God exists. If someone rose from the dead tomorrow, like randomly, and we both saw it, you believe in God, you would still think it's a big deal. I don't believe in God, I would think it's a big deal.
From a human standpoint, certainly a big deal. But from
what am I but a human?
From a potentiality standpoint, if God exists, then, let's put it this way. If from a potentiality standpoint, me making a half-court shot on the basketball, court is probably unlikely, right? I could maybe shoot, 1 in 50. But if I've got Steph Curry on my team, then the potentiality for hitting that half-court shot, although it's equally as impressive, it is much more. It's not as it's the potentiality is there for that to exist. I don't know if that's
I think what you're trying to say is that given God's power, it's easy for him to raise people from the dead.
Yes.
Right. But the point is that it seems like if God does exist, right, he's not very interested in demonstrating that often that he does in the way that he did 2,000 years ago, as you believe.
Well, I think that there are literally hundreds of thousands of testimonies of people who have experienced miracles. I think that it happens, more often than what people.
Yeah, I used to think that too. In fact, I thought I had a divine intervention myself. Right? I mean, look, it seems like there's so many contradictory accounts, so many testimonies, and not just testimonies of the divine. I mean, in the Enlightenment period, ironically, the quote unquote age of reason, right? There was a huge spike in testimonies of vampires, right? I mean, there's testimonies all over the place. There are testimonies of aliens, vampires, fairies. I mean, it's just not, the testimonies for me don't cut it.
Yeah. Look, I think that, I think that there is and let me think of the best way to state this for you. I think that when you look at the influence of Christianity and the claims in which it makes, that they warrant at least deciding upon why you believe that people wrote and said the things that they did in unison. This isn't just one person saying they saw Bigfoot. This is something that was, attested to by multiple different sources. It's also referenced, we see Josephus, Pliny the Younger, Tacitus, others.
Well, no, they don't attest to miracles. Those characters don't. What?
Josephus does.
No, where does Josephus record a miracle?
Josephus mentions the resurrection.
Okay, where?
I don't have the.
I don't think that's true, right? I think you might be mistaken about that. But the point is that if he did, I'd take him less seriously. I mean, look, there are probably people that recorded history and also said, "Oh, by the way, I saw a vampire last night." I mean, look, there are hundreds of testimonies and records of people saying they're vampires. The number, if there were 1,000 people, if there were 5,000, if there were 10,000, really doesn't make a difference to me.
So that would be the mass hallucination, right? So you're either saying that that there's so how do you explain that? Are these people, like with Bigfoot, we can go, hey, Joe Bob down the street, he did this because he wanted to get a bunch of clicks, or he wanted to get the reward money for saying that he got the picture of Bigfoot, and that's the motivation for which he's counterfeiting this. For something, or you could say, hey, it's a hallucination. They were all.
Well, how do we explain the testimonies that there were vampires in the 18th century? How do you explain that?
I don't think that we have the documentation for those that we have for the New Testament.
We have lots of documentation of people saying that they were vampires and revenants.
I'm not saying that we don't have people that said that they were there. I'm saying that we don't have document evidence that is uniform in the way that we do the New Testament that testifies to.
Okay, what is this evidence? Can you go over the evidence again? That's something unique to 2,000 years ago as compared to during the Enlightenment, where people were saying that there were open graves and revenants and vampires running around.
So, do you believe that the let's say the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John? Do you believe that these are firsthand accounts of Jesus' disciples?
Firsthand?
Yeah.
I don't. I think right now it's not clear that they're actually written by the people that are attributed Matthew, Mark.
I think it's fair to say that there are certainly scholars that would question that. I think
yes, absolutely. But there are also certain scholars that wouldn't.
Yeah, I think I don't know what the percentage in it is, if it's 60-40 or 70-30 or whatnot. I'm sure that the history is more on the side of actual authorship. But here's what I would say: so that regarding these, that we know that these sources, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, cannot be dated much further than the resurrection itself.
I'm fine to grant that.
You would grant that?
Yeah.
Okay, fair. So, and I appreciate that, because I think that, when you're educated on these things, I think that's helpful. And so when we understand, so whether it was Jesus's disciples or that are, by name there, or somebody else who is familiar, or maybe a disciple of a disciple type of situation, that there is painstaking effort in order to present accurate information. So
Painstaking during the first century?
So in the documents themselves, okay? So like when we look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, that when we see, so first of all, they don't mention the destruction of Jerusalem, so which was in 70 AD. So there is, there's pretty good evidence right there, which a lot of scholars would point to, that these were written before 70 AD, that all of them were written before 70 AD. So we have these within, on the long side, 40 years of the crucifixion of Jesus and the testimony of his resurrection. Okay, so when you look at these documents, they're geographically correct, meaning like if I were to try to write something, like if it was written by somebody later on, and like if I was, trying to write something about, San Francisco, I've been there one time, but I couldn't tell you, if you go, up a particular street or down a particular street, if you're changing elevation up or down, I wouldn't know, where the bay sat in relation exactly to the city. But when you look at the New Testament, specifically in the Gospels, you see accurate information about geography.
Yeah, but there's a lot of accurate information in fiction, and C.S. Lewis and Narnia and J.K. Rowling's, right? They mention all sorts of cities that do in fact exist, and presumably they're accurate, right? They're actually, and I could be corrected on this, but I think Rowling even mentioned certain geographical, actual topographical stuff that might be very accurate, right? So, I mean, but to me, that's not interesting in showing that it's not fiction, or it's not, a made-up account, or blah, blah, blah.
So you have, I think that you would be hard-pressed if you were to try to write something like, can you name a mayor or a governor of, let's say, in 1996 of North Dakota?
It wouldn't be hard to look it up.
Right. Today, it wouldn't be hard to look it up. But we had this figure Pontius Pilate, and we had zero evidence for Pontius Pilate. And that was referenced that he was the governor overseeing the crucifixion of Jesus. And we didn't have any archaeological evidence for that for a very long time, up until recently, that they discovered, evidence for his governorship during the first century in the place that Scripture said that it was at.
But do you think the Odyssey makes reference to geographical location, cities, mountains, rivers, oceans?
No, not with the accuracy that you have in the New Testament.
You're gonna have to show me.
I don't fault you. I don't know how much you've read the New Testament, but when you study out these proofs, these are not just simple references. They are immaculate details about these locations that you would not have. Like this is one.
Give me an example, because Pilate's not that good of an example. I would say that if Jesus caused an uproar, right, people are going to remember the guy that sentenced him to death, right? I mean, like, that's just going to be true for any kind of political stirrer. So it's not impressive to me that people would know the name. So what's something that you're pointing out that's particularly impressive?
So I want to make clear what I'm pointing out. So what I'm pointing out is that the writers of this were familiar with the time period, and the only way to be familiar, and the geography, and the only way to do that is if you were from there and you had lived through these experiences.
No, well, look, I don't think that people often insult the writers of the New Testament as like a bunch of goat herders. These were educated people. These were very highest educated echelon of people at the time, right? These were not just your random sheep, goat herders, shepherds, right? These are educated people, the most educated people of the time, upper echelon.
I wouldn't say we have a tax collector in Matthew, if it was Matthew that wrote it. We have somebody who would be considered a physician in Luke. Mark is if you take more the literal approach where I would, stand, Mark is believed to be the scribe for Peter, who was a fisherman, who's writing this out. And then we have John, who is, also a fisherman that's writing, his gospel. So, this is a mixture of different classes, that are presenting this. we have Paul, who I would grant you, who wrote a good majority of the New Testament, who would have been in that upper echelon of, he had Roman citizenship. He was trained under the greatest, rabbis of his day. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. We know, quite a bit about him in that regard. So yeah, those credentials are there. But what you're seeing people from fishermen to tax collectors to actual, critics. Like, you have to deal with both James, the half brother of Jesus, who denied his divinity during his life, who all evidence points to the fact that he did not attend his crucifixion and his death sentence, that later on in life, after the resurrection, actually he has an experience with Jesus. He sees him in the flesh, and he puts his faith in his brother, who he thought was just crazy and dishonoring the family.
You have to deal with it, right? Like, what is it that I have to deal with?
I think that it's to have the representations that we do in history and not take that seriously as something that we have to try to make sense for, I think is being naive.
I don't see what look. This is the way I see what happened as far as the first, second century of the Bible. What happened was the Bible in the first century was just the Old Testament. There was no canon in the first century, right? What happened was the scriptures were completely the scriptures were completely oral at the time. Whatever you call the New Testament at best was orally carried down and then at some point written. I'm not convinced that the writers of what you point to as the New Testament are the actual disciples of Christ or people that knew Christ. I think what's probably more likely is that, yes, Jesus' teachings and the people that were around him, conveyed his thoughts and his teachings to people that then memorized them and carried them orally. And then at some point, someone wrote them down because there was no canon in the first century and at the second century at that too. So that's how I deal with it, quote unquote.
Yeah. Okay. So, a couple things. So there was an Old Testament canon at the time of Christ that was well established. That's one reason why Protestants don't accept the Apocrypha, in the Catholic, tradition, because it wasn't part of the Old Testament canon at that time. And I think that it is. I don't disagree that there was potentially some sort of oral, tradition that was there, but I don't think that you get the detail that we have. When you look at, say, the Gnostic Gospels, okay, they have about like the Gospel of Thomas. It might have like 6 or 8 or 10 different names in the book. Okay, so like if I were to write something about first century Israel or Judea, I could come up with a few names that are Jewish sounding names, and I could present those. But what I wouldn't know is which names need what's called, basically, to put some sort of
Sorry, are you disagreeing with what I said or no?
I'm saying that, which part specifically?
What I said that I gave my model, right? Yeah. There was no New Testament canon, right? There were Jesus' teachings seemed to be passed orally, and then there were writings kind of around. And, a lot of what probably happened is that this oral tradition was then recorded by people. And then later on, retrospectively, they were given the authors were given names. And that's how I see sort of the New Testament, more or less, is that you did not start with, you really start with an oral tradition that later developed into a more written kind of canon that developed after sort of the first century, second century, or whatever.
Yeah, so in the second century, we start to see, early kind of canon lists of what books were part of this part of this holy testimony that's presented, that we eventually become, to know as the canon. And that was in response to false teachings that were coming up, specifically among the Gnostics and different things like that, that they were trying to present other books that were, false writings, and that had, things like the Gospel of Thomas and Gospel of Barnabas and other things that were starting to surface. And so we see, early canon lists in the second century.
So we agree on that point, right?
Yeah, there's not a formalized canon at the end of say the first century that's been detailed as a list. No, but
right. So the authority, right, was based on, and at least as early as in the first century, the bishop, the oral tradition of those bishops.
So I would disagree with that, and I think that so I think we're partially there together. I agree that there was not a formalized canon list, but what there was. So first off, we see in Peter's writings that he calls the letters of Paul scripture. So that in the first.
Sorry, say that again.
So Peter in the book of, and I my computer's dead here, so I'm in a hotel kind of on the road, but it's either First or Second Peter, that Peter refers to Paul's letters, the epistles in the New Testament. He refers to those as scripture. So there is a belief existing within the first century. Not, and this Peter and Paul died in 64 and 66 AD. So they're within 30 years of the death of Christ. So this writings would have been.
I'm not saying you're wrong. Do you know the verse there?
Give me one. Give me 1 second here. Let me grab it.
Tad, I don't really talk about this stuff very often.
Okay, cool. I got 2 Peter 3, 15 and 16.
Okay. Okay. Go ahead and say what you were saying. I'll just look it up while you're talking.
Yeah. So Peter refers to, and it's a simple reference, but he refers to the writings of Paul as scripture. Okay. So the word he uses in the Greek puts them on the same, the epistles of Paul on the same level as the writings of the Old Testament. So you have two Jewish thinkers here that Peter is ascribing to Paul's letters, and Peter, disciple of Jesus, like although Paul did not know Jesus, other than him appearing to him, in a vision after he had ascended into heaven, Peter actually walked with Christ, would have known Jesus's teachings, would have been one of the ones who saw the tomb, who put his hands in his, the holes in his side and his hands. And so Peter calls Paul's testimony scripture and is affirming Paul basically the accuracy, the authenticity, and the fact that it is the inerrancy of Paul's own letters, in this statement.
Okay, so what is that supposed to show?
So it shows that you have somebody who walked with Jesus. Okay, we don't have a lot of question about who wrote, Peter's letters. We know that, we have a lot of history on him as a leader in the church, everything else as a disciple of Jesus. We know, where, he died, those sorts of things. And we have evidence that he holds to the testimony of Paul. Now, why that's interesting is because when we talk about the canon, although, you could make a case for the Gospels being written later. Somebody could come out and say, the Gospels weren't written until 90 AD. They just didn't mention the destruction of the temple, but that doesn't mean it hadn't happened yet. And maybe they were written in 100, first, basically the turn of the century there or whatever. But the problem that we run into is that we have evidence of when Paul wrote his letters. We know that.
Yeah, so we disagree. Am I correct in saying that we disagree that at least in the first, second centuries, right, that if you were just a normal follower of Christ, you don't have a position of authority, right, that you look at the bishops, you look at what people, like this is where I believe Ignatius had a very famous letter that was one of the first ones to say, hey, don't follow people that don't have the teachings that come from the original apostles. Some people call that apostolic succession, right? So if I'm a normal Christian in, let's say, 90 AD or whatever, right? I have to rely on that oral tradition, and I have to make sure I got the right oral tradition from someone that is been established to have apostolic succession, right? I don't have a Bible. right? And there is no thing like a Bible, like the kind of thing that you have. There are letters going around. There are Gnostic letters. There's this letter. There's that letter. But inevitably, it all comes down to, who has apostolic succession in the first century, and who are the relevant bishops that have that, right? I guess to me, that's the only way.
I would say it's slightly more complicated than that. I think that there is, quite a bit of that I think you're presenting a real scenario. But I think that they did have, there would have been various copies of Paul's letters that would have been duplicated by that.
Yeah, but if you're a normal Joe Blow Christian, you may not know, especially not the living at the time of Christ. You don't have the knowledge, the tools to know whether the Gnostic Gospels or Paul's letters or this letter or that letter is any good. You have to rely on an oral tradition. You have to rely on that tradition.
So I think that you would be relying on partially oral tradition, partially some of those copies for those that have them. It's not going to be universal like we have a Bible in every hotel room. I think you also have things like the Didache, which is known as the Teachings of the Apostles. It's one of the first Christian books that was assimilated, and it was based upon it's not canon, it's not part of the New Testament, but it's recognized as a writing in the succession of Christian teaching that somebody wrote down a collection of the apostles' teachings, and it lines up with the New Testament. This is actually where we get the kind of famous statement in the Didache is that it condemns abortion in the first century. And so that is, everybody always wants to, argue that on the kind of, I don't know, I'm not trying to make this political, but obviously on the, conversation day on whether or not it's a Christian position or a new fabrication, but that was a Christian position within the first, the first 100 years of Christianity. So the point that I'm making here is that Paul's letters are verified by people who walked with Jesus that are saying that the things that Paul is saying.
Yeah, but how is a person at 90? Okay, so let's kind of start where this kind of reset what's going on here. So you told me, look, Danny, there's great evidence for the resurrection, and then one of the things you pointed to is look at the Gospels, look at the New Testament, the Synoptic Gospels or whatever, or Paul's letters. I'm like, okay, I'm looking at them. Well, you see, so now what am I supposed to gather from them that indicates that someone rose from the dead?
Well, you have Paul. So you would have people out there that would say, in a modern sense, that Jesus never rose from the dead. This is all kind of a dream that Paul had. It's just based upon his fanatical teachings, and that just shaped a bunch of people. It's no different than the Book of Mormon or Islam.
I'm not saying any of that. Let's say I don't know what happened. Okay, let's say I don't know what happened.
You don't know what happened.
You're saying I know what happened. It's resurrection, and then I'm like, okay, but what about the data points to resurrection? And then I'm not really seeing it.
So I think that, when you look at, so Peter specifically, he was a disciple of Jesus. He walks with Jesus. We have, before the Gospels are even penned, we have Peter affirming the testimony of Paul that shares clearly the message of Jesus Christ and the resurrection. And
but why should I believe him?
What's that?
Why should I believe him? Why should I believe that text?
Yeah, so one of the things that Paul does in his writings, he says this in 1 Corinthians 15, is he references, as he's sending this letter to Rome, where many of these people had kind of fled to, that he states that many of the 500 who had witnessed Jesus were still alive. And then he actually
lists, but why should I believe him that there are 500 witnesses?
Well, I'm saying that this would have been something that people could have verified at that time.
But how do I verify it is the question.
I'm saying that the evidence shows that it was verified then, and that gives us credibility.
Why should I believe it's been verified?
So, because if I were to say something in the town in which something happened, that, hey guys, just, it's like the equivalent of the modern, like, trust me, bro, right? And so, which is what you're feeling right now. Like, hey, just trust me, bro, this guy raised from the dead. Like, I'm sure there's probably part of you that would go, I would love to believe that, there's a thing called heaven and that we can all go there. But like, I need more than just trust me, bro. Right. So Paul gives us more than trust me, bro. He writes to people that were witnesses, that knew people who lived at that time. He references some of them by name, essentially saying,
why should I believe him there, though? He's saying that they're witnesses. Why should I count them as those people as witnesses?
Because you can't go to the town in which something happened and say, go talk to these people and have it be taken seriously if it can be fact-checked immediately by the people that you're referencing.
So look, there are people that say, look, I know witnesses to vampire sightings, right? I have witnesses that have seen vampires. You and I are not going to accept that, right?
Correct.
All right. So to me, it's so far, what is disanalogous? Be precise in the data if you could. What's disanalogous from that case to Paul saying, I know witnesses of a resurrection?
So great question. So one of the things about this is that Jesus was not a random figure, right? He was not just somebody that I saw in a crowd and I go, I think he had pointed teeth, or I thought he was there for a second and then he disappeared. What we have that they claim that they spent 40 days with him, and this is somebody that they knew previously.
Yeah, but the vampire people said that they spent 40 days with the vampires. What if they said that? You would just think they're vampires now?
No, I would say that I don't think the claims are there that they've spent 40 days, with them.
Well, then I'm saying the same thing about the resurrection here.
Yeah, so I think that what we have with the resurrection is we have documented evidence that demonstrates the fact that they spent 40 days.
Okay, so if a person said there's documented evidence of vampire sightings, you and I are not going to accept that either.
If I think that what you see that's different about the New Testament, and I don't think this point was understood earlier, is that if they are being accurate with the minutia, then there is, and even with the name Jesus, this is the interesting thing, is that every time the disciples say the name Jesus, they refer to him as Jesus, right? Whenever they're talking about Jesus outside of their intimate relationship with him, they give something that is a ambiguation to him. So Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the carpenter's son, Jesus, wasn't he
Vlad the Impaler?
So what they're saying, but you wouldn't know that unless you were from there, that you have to give that disambiguation to his name, because it was actually a very common first century name. And so they're giving this in a way, they are going through painstakingly showing you detailed, handling why, if they're telling the truth about all of the typography, if they're telling the truth about all of the names, if they're telling the truth about all of the political figures and all the archaeological things that we can verify, why would they not tell the truth about the one most important aspect of this?
Well, why wouldn't, look, again, when people make claims about seeing ghouls and vampires and zombies, why would they lie about that? I mean, look, I guess what I'm trying to say is that if I accept your standard of evidence, right, not only am I going to be a Christian, but I'm going to think that there are vampires, that they're zombies, and that they're ghouls, right? Your standards of evidence are so thin, right, so weak, in my opinion, that I would have to believe in all these other things, and I'm just not prepared for that, man. I mean, I don't think you are either.
Hey, I think agree to disagree on that. I think that, I don't know how much, again, that you dove into, the manuscript evidence. I think there's more there than what you're, giving credit to for it. I understand the challenges, and I get that.
Maybe there is, but I just haven't heard it.
Yeah, I'd encourage you, man, keep searching for it. I think we got probably an impasse on that issue. I wish I had internet here. I'd be able to pull up a bunch more things for you now.
One of the reasons why I came up was because I wanted to talk about why I need Jesus. Okay. Let's say that Jesus did die and resurrect. Let's say that we grant most of the common claims of the Bible, right? I don't understand why I would need Jesus.
So if God is real, if Jesus is God in the flesh, then what we also have that's real is this thing called sin. And I think that, we have, we haven't talked about any of the other, sociological or, anthropomorphic, evidences for God in terms of common morality and, objective morality, these sorts of things. But let's just say that you grant all that to me. I think that the what Christianity presents is that there is a chasm that exists between the righteousness of God and the sinfulness of man, and that we cannot bridge that ourselves. If you and I were to have a contest to see who could jump over the Grand Canyon, it doesn't matter if you can jump further than me. We're both going to fall. And it doesn't matter if righteousness can only be, the Bible says that if you break one of the laws of the Old Testament, that you're guilty of breaking all of them. So if I've ever told a lie, then I'm the same as an adulterer or murderer.
Maybe we can cut to do I need Jesus to avoid hell? Is that it?
I think that's one aspect. Certainly, yes.
Okay. Then I would accept that. Like, I don't want, if Christianity is true, I don't want to go to hell. And if Jesus is the means of avoiding hell, and hell's like something like eternal conscious torment, I'm with you. But if you're saying I need Jesus for any other reason, I don't get it.
So I would say that I don't believe that God's intention is for Jesus only to be fire insurance. I think that certainly he's here to seek and save the lost, but I think he brings fullness. I think that
fullness. I have fullness.
Okay, but you would not have, even if you were escaping hell. It's not just escaping hell; it is a promise of a personal resurrection to yourself and hope for eternity.
What's a personal resurrection? You mean like heaven?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I get it. If it's, to me, Jesus and the gospel is a carrots and sticks thing. Okay. I just don't, if it weren't for hell and heaven, there's nothing interesting about what Jesus could offer you.
Having fellowship with the creator of the universe is not interesting.
What fellowship? What do you have with God that I don't have with my wife?
I think that you have, look, I have a great relationship with my wife. I've been married going on 24 years. I love my wife, and I think that the love that we have is symbolic. I think that that's actually what marriage is that it is put there to show us as sort of what I would call a type and a shadow of the relationship that the church has with Christ. And so we see something in marriage that, reflects the witness of God's heart for humanity. But I still think that it is lacking in completely fulfilling that. I think we're able to get 90% of the way there, but there's still that 10%.
But what does God give you that my wife does not give me?
I don't,
other than the afterlife stuff.
Yeah, I think that, I'm not going to pretend to speak to your marriage, but I think that unconditional love is not a human, it's not something that's innate within humans.
Well, I think unconditional love is kind of, you don't even have unconditional love. I mean, do you have unconditional love for the creator of the universe?
I think that he has unconditional love for us. And
is it, okay, but it seems like it's conditional. You must believe, right, to be saved.
No, I think that it is that. So that's an interesting question. So that kind of gets into the problem of evil, right? And that is kind of why this is what it is. So my personal
the point, what I'm saying is, that if God had unconditional love for me, then I wouldn't need to believe, right?
I think that what you're missing in that is understanding the reason for the cross. Is that when you look at what happened with mankind, so 30-second version, God creates man, he puts him in a garden. We have this being called Lucifer, this angelic, guardian angel that's there protecting us. He turns on God by getting us to commit the same offense that he himself commits, which is rebellion against God, that we see through this, seemingly arbitrary thing called the tree of
Look, the point is, and by the way, I think unconditional love is actually kind of crazy. If my wife said, I have unconditional love for you, I would actually be kind of scared, right? When
you've experienced it, it's a beautiful thing.
Wait, no, but think about what unconditional love is. Unconditional love is something like this, right? That I'm willing to unalive 1 million babies for you, right? That's unconditional, right? Like there's no, if I unalived 1 million babies, I'll still love you and I'll still be with you. I mean, that's crazy, right? It seems like unconditional love is like the literally like unhealthy kind of love. It seems like it's actually more reasonable to have conditional love, number one. And I think your God does have conditions on his love. Like, does he love those in hell? Does he love Satan?
So yeah, great question. So I believe that the cross was necessary in order to justly punish man for the sins that were committed in the person of Christ. He took what we deserved. And by doing so, it allowed God to be able to justly punish and dethrone the devil.
Well, no. Okay. But it seems like unconditional love would actually suspend justice.
He couldn't, because then it would for his perfect justice would force him to also suspend that for Lucifer as well, for the devil. So from a Christian belief, God had to, the reason why the cross was necessary was because there had to be also a punishment. If he's going to just, flick, Satan out of the universe because he rebelled against him and went after us, we committed the same offense. Therefore, he has to do the same punishment to us. So in order to justly punish the devil, he has to become
Here's what I'm saying, right? Look, if let's say there's a judge in Texas, okay, who is sentencing their daughter because of a DUI. Now, the judge has to decide, do I love my daughter so much that I won't do my job and I'll just let her go? That's unconditional love. Or, yes, I love her, but it's conditioned. She broke the law. She had endangered other people, and she needs to go to prison. It seems like your God is like the just judge who has conditions for love.
Yeah, look, I think that probably a better term that I could have used would have been, if I want to stay in the Greek, it would be called the Zoe, this life of God. It's an agape, love. It is something that is a unique love that God has that's
more or less sacrificial love.
Right. And so, we see what he is willing to do. Now,
my wife has sacrificial love for me. She's actually told me she would, and it's scary how much, she would actually take a bullet for me and die for me. Like, she's told me that, and I would do the same. But I have that with her.
I think, man, it sounds like you have a great marriage, and that's a good thing.
I don't need Jesus except for fire insurance.
Yeah. I think if you live long enough, that there is a yearning and desire to know your maker, to know your creator, to have an intimacy with. But
you're not telling me any of those benefits, of being with your creator or having a relationship with your creator. It seems like, in fact, here's the question. If God disappeared for 24 hours, or actually for a month, what would be different in your life?
I think a lot. I think I would have tremendous anxiety. Look, the Lord freed me from anxiety. He's freed me from fear. I think that, I've seen him free me from addiction.
So if you became anxious tomorrow and then you went back into addiction, then that might be evidence that God does not exist, because you're saying that your relationship with God prevents you from being anxious and falling into addiction.
I'm saying that, his principles and precepts put into place in my life, and his power in my life has saved me.
But think about what I'm asking. I'm asking, if God disappears for a month, what would happen? You're saying I would get anxious, I would fall back into addiction, all that, which means that if that happens, if tomorrow your anxiety spikes and you went back into addiction, you should believe that God has left you, right? You should believe that there may not be a God. Either one.
Yeah, look, I mean, everybody has their personal experience, right? And I'll tell you that, I know what my life was like before God, and I know what my life was like after God. And I think that's hard to argue with. I know what God has done at various points in my life in coming through, for my wife and I in tremendous ways, against all odds. And so I see evidence of the promises that are in the New Testament, that combined with the data that's available for me, it's pretty easy to put faith in him.
All right. Well, I'm going to take my lead. Look, you let me interrupt you when I wanted. You're a decent interlocutor. I did feel like some of my questions weren't directly answered, but every time you let me interrupt you, and I appreciate for being a good sport about that. So thanks for the conversation, Lucas. There's a guy named, if you like talking about Jesus' resurrection and stuff like that, there's a guy that I learned a little bit from. He should be in the request box. His name is Sir. He's very polite, respectful, and knowledgeable about the topic. You might enjoy it. But thanks for having me up. You have a great night.
Appreciate it, Danny. Thank you.